Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Smarter Together webinar. This is the 16th webinar in our series, which started in May to bring you information on impactful research and community development projects here in Georgia. I'm Greg McCormick with the Georgia Tech's Smart Cities and Inclusive Innovation Group and Director of the Georgia Smart Communities Challenge. Before we get started, I want to let you know that today's webinar is being recorded, and we'll make that recording as well as the slides available to you for download for future use. They'll be available on our media page, and the link has been provided in the chat area. After today's presentation, we will go into a discussion where we do ask for your questions, which will be discussed by our panel. So please do utilize the Q&A area on the right side of your screen to ask those questions at any time during the presentation or discussion period. We're very excited today to have with us Nancy Greenlee, Professor in the School of City and Regional Planning and Associate Dean for Research in the College of Design at Georgia Tech, as well as Julia Wood, VP for Development and Donor Services at the Community Foundation of Central Georgia, and John Henry, CEO of Douglas Coffee Chamber of Commerce. And our moderator today is Alyssa Justice, Senior Community Development Policy Analyst at Georgia Department of Community Affairs. Today's webinar is about the research from this past summer as part of the Smart Community Core program at Georgia Tech, which looked at community and economic development for smaller communities in our state with a focus on an economic development profile for the city of Douglas here in Georgia. So welcome everyone, welcome panelists, and now I'd like to hand it over to Nancy to get started.
Okay. So what I thought I would do in my talk today is just present to you the framework that the students used with me advising them on this framework. This is a framework I developed for how they would go about creating the economic profile for Douglas. And as we went through and discovered different indicators about what the city was like and who its population was and what its assets were, et cetera, we were able to, using this framework, create a set of recommendations for Douglas out of this profile. So what I'll do is I wanted to go through sort of the framework that I use in economic development, which is actually different than a lot of what I call traditional economic development practice, and then talk about the recommendations that the students came up with working with this framework. Next slide. So first, and an important point to make is that, as was just stated, I'm a professor of city and regional planning at Georgia Tech. My specialization is economic development planning. So economic development work and practice, but with a planning framework, which can be more spatially oriented and which is more focused on people within communities as well often. So this is just a cartoon that I have used for many years because it really talks about why we need to be doing economic development planning, but why we often don't do it. So the first box there says, sure, it'd be nice to do something about poverty, but let's wait until the economy picks up. That's when we're in a recession. And then next box, of course, we need to fund a national health plan, but the markets are jittery right now. So raising taxes now would put us back into a recession, and that was in the recovery phase. So we're going from recession to recovery, and this is a long-term business cycle that this country goes through. We move now to prosperity, which is where we were pretty much just before March of this year. There just isn't any political will to pass any new programs. People are too busy working multiple jobs to focus. And the other person says, besides, with unemployment this low, anyone who's poor has no one to blame but themselves. And then back into recession. We really should have built that safety net when we had the money. Yeah, we should have, says his colleague. We should have prepared for this. Anyway, let's fire some people. So that's the normal, that's a characterization, granted in cartoon form, of what typically happens in economic development and in our business cycle. Of course, what's very different about it this year is that we were forced into a recession by a major pandemic, and that's the first experience this country, well, maybe some people would argue the second, because of our flu in the early 1900s. Next slide. So from there is an argument that we always need to be development planning for those reasons that the cartoon sort of characterizes in very simplistic form. But then what kind of economic development do we practice and planning do we do? I've distinguished what I call traditional economic development practice and planning, which acronym is TED, from sustainable local economic development planning, which is the acronym is SLED. And traditional economic development has long been defined as wealth creation, job, and within that, job creation is often singled out, particularly in political circles, because jobs make voters vote positively. It's a view, really, and it's repeated in many, many places, in many sources of literature and in many think tanks, that economic growth equals economic development. So economic growth equals economic development. Next slide. But traditional economic development practice has given us some things besides wealth and job creation. There are many that argue, Thomas Friedman, a key one, that climate change is a result of our economic development patterns. He doesn't call it, he calls it global weirding as well as global warming, because actually the economy becomes the environment and our climate forces become much more erratic as the Earth warms up. So it's a more accurate term in many ways. We have carbon emissions that are made by our own machinery that have led to rising temperatures. But we have subsequently, as the Earth warms, more extremes in temperature, rainfall, violent storms. We've just witnessed 2 hurricanes, very devastating ones, in the last month that are partially attributable to the warming of the oceans, according to the meteorologists. And of course, these have devastating impacts for national and local economies. So that's one aspect of traditional economic development's impacts on climate. We also have sprawl, where we've continued to grow, but we have not grown in ways that conserve the use of land or really focus strongly on the redevelopment of areas that have become obsolete. We've had expanding suburbs ever since the 1950s and post-World War II. And sprawl has led to a lot of economic development, housing, businesses, etc. But it's also created a wasteful use of natural resources in an inefficient built environment. An inefficient built environment that we don't have the money at the national level, or seem to not be able to come up with it, to fund the built environments to be in good repair. We have a major infrastructure crisis, which we still are unable to address. And under the traditional economic development practice, our workforce has been disproportionately low wage, and I'll talk some more about that shortly. And the other thing that has accompanied this traditional economic development pattern is growing inequality. We have started thinking about it and being quite concerned about it in the 1970s, but it's like the business cycle cartoon. There'll be concerns about it, and then there's a growth occurrence, a period of growth, and we don't worry about it as much until just recently. Just recently, there has been widespread concern about the growing inequality in this country, recognized at all levels, and we're in a very poor position now to do as much about it as we would like to be able to, because of the fallout of the pandemic, which we have not begun to see what it really means in terms of the economy. Next slide. So the problem with low-wage work, there are multiple problems, but it creates economic vulnerability. In recent data, pre-COVID, so this is November of 2019, has found that 53 million Americans, or 44% of workers aged 18 to 64 years old, are low wage. The low wage group's median hourly wages are $10.22, median annual earnings are $18,000. And in particular, this recent research, this is from a Brookings study that I've cited below at the bottom of the slide. Low-wage workers make up the highest share of the workforce in smaller places in the South and West. So that's something to keep in mind as we think about Douglas among many cities in the South and West, which have a pretty large low-wage workforce. Next slide. So moving from that, some of the problems of traditional practice of economic development that we hope to change, we hope to sort of continue to create wealth and create jobs, but to ask more of the economic development practice, to expect more, and to remediate the unintended consequences that we've had, such as growing inequality and climate weirding, global weirding from the traditional practices. So to define economic development, distinguishing development from growth, it's more than economic growth, job and wealth creation. Instead, it's a process that increases quality of life and living standards, decreases inequality, and promotes sustainability. Next slide. So there are three principles for practicing what I call sustainable local economic development. One, that we establish a minimum standard of living for all that increases over time, because that would mean that we're advancing our economy. That it reduces inequality between demographic groups by age, gender, race, and ethnicity, and that it also reduces it by spatially defined groups, indigenous populations versus immigrants, or old-timers versus newcomers, urban and rural residents, central city and suburban residents. And three, that it promotes and develops sustainable resource use and production. And in fact, it looks for new economic activity, new industries, new occupations that are engaged in sustainable resource use and production. Next slide. To practice sustainable local economic development, there's a critical need to understand structural changes that are occurring in the economy. So what does that mean for job creation and job elimination, industries that die, other industries that innovation leads to new industries and new business opportunities. So industries and jobs will always figure very prominently in thinking about sustainable local economic development and in thinking about what is the future of work in general. That has also been a major topic of discussion in the last decade or so, as we've seen the rise of automation and robots use. So, and there's a big question that my own research has focused on about how many robots are in use, where are they, how are they affecting local economies and local labor markets, and what will be the ongoing, what can we expect as there's further development of traditional industrial robots, but also in particular collaborative robots. And I'm currently doing research on that that's being funded by the National Science Foundation. We recently conducted a survey of robot adoption in manufacturing, which I think is relevant for thinking about Douglas, since they have a large number of the workforce, a large percentage of the workforce is in manufacturing. And our findings from that national survey were that the demand for the robotic related skills among workers is increasing over time. We actually found, and there has been an argument that the doom and gloom scenario on robots is that they will eliminate all jobs, so there will be no future of work. that's more than a little extreme. And the thing that we found very interestingly in subsequent research that fed off of this manufacturing survey is we looked at job advertisements throughout the country, looking specifically for those that were asking for robotic skills, and found that jobs postings that demand robotic skills in 2010 predicted approximately 2% growth in manufacturing employment, largely in advanced manufacturing. So you actually, in advanced manufacturing, and that's why it's important to go back and think about what's the industry profile of a community. In advanced manufacturing, robots are actually creating more work, but they are creating work that requires higher skills. And what is expected is that there will be increased adoption of labor replacing robots in low-wage manufacturing as robots become increasingly affordable and their costs are going down significantly every year, and as they become easier to operate. This has a high relevance for Douglas, given the manufacturing that they have at the moment in Douglas. Next slide. So just a little, another cartoon that I think is a really good way to characterize structural change. So on the left side, there's a robot talking to someone who's just graduated, and the robot says, "Haven't you heard? The Industrial Revolution is over. We won." But the slide next to that is two men talking, and they're commiserating, and one says to the other, "At least you were replaced with a 2-ton industrial robot. I was replaced with an app." So it's, and very much that very much reflects on, it's not just robotics, but it's artificial intelligence, which is part of robotics, but artificial intelligence and other advances in information technology, software, etc., creates new opportunities to replace all kinds of labor, not just in manufacturing, but in highly sought after professional jobs in law and banking and all kinds of fields, simply with apps. Next slide. So to practice sustainable local economic development planning, communities need to understand how global trends and problems can affect their locality, their firms, and their demographic groups. They need to conduct resiliency planning that creates community, business, and citizen capacity to respond to environmental, economic, and social change. And importantly, they need to integrate workforce development with local economic development to respond to structural industry change so that there will be continuation of work. There will be new jobs and jobs of the future that appear in their community. This last point's an important one because traditionally, in traditional economic development, this is a pretty well-accepted view, is that it's been fairly divorced from workforce development. And more than ever, especially with the rise of technologies that can substitute human labor for machinery or apps, the two need to be much closer married together in order to do effective planning and create strong economies that are resilient. Next slide. So that is the framework that informed the Douglas Economic Development Research. And there were 3 great interns from Georgia Tech: Sarah Diet, a master's student in city regional planning; Ian Frazier, a master's student in public policy; and Nigel James, an undergrad in industrial engineering, that were the interns. And they created a comprehensive profile of the city of Douglas, which is, I'm not going to repeat all the findings from the profile because it's available, and I would assume the link can be put up after this, once this material gets onto your website. But they created a comprehensive profile of the city of Douglas. They interviewed community leaders for insight into the city's resources. That's always extremely important to understand what the experts in the city and the leaders of the cities have to say about what their city's strengths and weaknesses are and what their resources are. They researched city history, industry, employment, housing, community amenities, and population characteristics. Some of that was going to data sources and collecting the data to create the profile. Other parts of it were literally Nigel, who lived in the community, documenting community amenities and assets such as park systems, etc. And then they provided recommendations for next steps and strategies, which is what I'll focus on. Next slide. So the strategies and next steps that they came up with I think were a really comprehensive set, and truly that's what is needed if you're really doing an economic development plan in a small community. And it looked at things that had been done, tools that might be there that weren't being utilized, vulnerabilities that exist in the community. So starting with, they recommend that there's a planned housing study to initiate improvements in the city's housing stock. And that reflects the city's desire to be able to attract new people to the city, and particularly focusing on a professional class of workers and businesses to support those professional class workers, or perhaps they bring their own businesses with them. But there's a large desire to essentially, in many ways, kind of flesh out what we might call the middle class of Douglas. So an important criterion for that is to have quality housing. So this planned housing study is critical to initiate improvements in city housing stock. But it's important to determine if there's actually the market there for the workforce housing and where the best location for the housing would be. And then another aspect of when they began to look at the housing situation was the city has a large proportion of manufactured housing. And much of it is a reflection of the low wage workforce and what they can afford in housing. So they recommend looking carefully at the management of a risk management strategy for manufacturing housing, exploring site risk and the need for resiliency plans. That's because with our increasing storms, tornadoes, etc., that's occurring, those that are living, for example, in mobile homes are extraordinarily vulnerable to tornadoes. They saw a lot of need for updating of legal non-conforming uses to current code standards to increase safety and to make sure that these homes are properly installed and anchored. So it's not uncommon in small towns and rural areas to have a range of what we call a broadly manufactured housing, but that stock is not necessarily safe, or is it something that creates a strong positive perception in the community? Actually, there are cases where there's very sophisticated mobile home parks that are zoned as planned affordable communities, particularly in places like California, that are sort of models for moving away from the stigma of manufactured housing and mobile parks that may be worth while to examine. They also suggested, they found doing their research that there was an enterprise zone that was created for Douglas that had never been implemented. And that enterprise zone provides financial incentives, tax incentives to have housing or retail or other economic activity developed. It's something to entice developers to come to Douglas and to create new housing and retail, for example. So they suggested that the city go back and think about that and whether that might be something that can help them meet some of their redevelopment and economic development goals. Next slide, please. They also thought a lot about sort of the issues of kind of quality of life and opportunities for leisure and explore culture, etc. in Douglas. That's all part of what would be a high quality community, desirable community. So they suggested there could be more recreational programs for residents of different interests and ages, such as rock climbing, cooking classes, fitness classes, things that appeal to different generations, and particularly to maybe a younger, more mobile generation that you're trying to attract. And then adding sites to attract more visitors to the recreational areas that exist, because there is a fair amount of recreational space, but it's not programmed very well, so it's not being taken advantage of. And there are actually economic development opportunities by doing that, creating farmers markets and food trucks, things like that could bring people out to enjoy the recreational area and also create opportunities for small business development. They felt like the student retention, there should be student retention strategies to achieve greater high school graduation rates. The graduation rates in Douglas aren't bad compared to the state of Georgia, but it's in everyone's best interest if they continue to strengthen. And one of the key factors that leads students to drop out, particularly in rural areas, is actually just that they don't have a lot of money. They need to make money, and they will leave school and start working at low wage dead-end jobs. So they cited Southwire's 12 for Life program as something that Douglas could consider trying to create. And that specifically is the firm, Southwire, in Carrollton, actually pays high school students to graduate, to stay in school, and they work at Southwire part-time while they're in school. And then finally, to focus on strengthening the connection between high schools and local colleges to increase students' knowledge of career opportunities. So that is to show them that there are different kinds of possibilities other than low-wage work and what it would take to be able to pursue those opportunities. Next slide, please. The other thing that became quickly evident by looking at the data is that there are a lot of workers that commute into Douglas for their jobs, but then they leave. And so Douglas itself is not getting to have the advantages of workers perhaps supporting restaurants and other retail activity, or buying housing and living within the city. So there's a lot of the workers are living in the county or elsewhere. So they were thinking about strategies for keeping workers in, but the other thought was the idea of a city-county consolidation. So there are city-county governments, local governments in the state of Georgia and other places. I don't know if it's been a topic of discussion for Douglas and Coffee County, but when it does happen, it means that the city isn't providing services and amenities to a population that's not paying the city taxes. It helps the city generate more tax revenue, which in turn can be invested in other amenities, infrastructure that will make the city more attractive. Another strategy was to prioritize skilled jobs and workers, which is clearly something that the city is interested in. Part of that is pursuing what we call the bring them home strategy, so that your best and brightest who go off to college, you want them to, and this is a key thing that many small towns and rural communities want, they want them to come home and have bring their businesses with them, their skills with them that attract other employers, etc. but sometimes that can be difficult to do if the community is not considered one that's really desirable to live in or high quality. They noted that you could also think outside the box, which there are small communities around the country that have done some very interesting things, such as in Kentucky, they made available housing that had been foreclosed on to artists from California, and subsequently it's developed a really strong arts community, cultural community that's attracting tourists and leading to the development of restaurants, etc. So perhaps thinking about those kinds of programs that are kind of a creative thing to bring new populations to a city that would be such as artists and creative types that typically don't make a lot of money but offer they augment and make the city more desirable. And then the strategy that the students focused on when we looked at the statistics on the data of Douglas, and that 50% of its population is Black, 50% is white. There was great disparities and great inequality between whites and Blacks in terms of their earnings, their income. We thought that it was really important that Douglas acknowledge and try and embrace this idea. There are many reasons to do this, but just from an economic development point of view, it would make Douglas a much more successful and higher quality with higher living standards town if the Black population had better jobs and were education and skills to earn more equivalently or to the equivalent of what the white population is earning. It would radically change Douglas's total income, and that income would be used in support of much higher quality and standards of living. Next slide. And I think that's my final slide. So there was this, I'll end with this paragraph that was actually in the report. Douglas still struggles with issues of racial inequality and inequity. According to the U.S. Census Bureau's 2019 estimates, 50.8% of the city's residents are Black, but just 493 of the 1,624 businesses in the city limits were owned by minorities. According to the 2018 American Community Survey estimates, the average household income in the public use microdata area in which Douglas is located was $23,290 for Black households. For white households, it was $62,692 and change. That is, Black household income is 63% lower than white household. So Douglas, this situation in Douglas is not unlike many small rural and particularly southern towns, but it's something that holds the town back. If the entire population is able to achieve higher job opportunities, higher economic opportunities, higher levels of business ownership, it would make a profound difference in Douglas and what Douglas could become. And so, besides being something that we would like to see remediated, I think, as a society, because we increasingly understand how unequal our society has become and what that means for the health of this country. So I'll leave it with that.
Thank you, Nancy. Great starting presentation. Let me ask John and Julia to join as well as we get into this discussion. And this is what makes this research so interesting, is that just the backdrop was that it was obviously Georgia Tech research, but it was done in collaboration with the local foundation, with Julia's leadership, and then, of course, really closely engaging John, if you want to turn your screen on, the Economic Development Authority. So it really became a partnership between university research, local foundation, and economic development authority, and sort of what you were alluding to during your presentation of how best to marry this. Now that you have this data-driven local context interviews with that. But let me start with Julia, and obviously just tell me, start by, the role of the foundation in this space. Obviously, the community foundation is a pillar in the local community, and then of course how the goals of the project evolved with this research, and also especially the pandemic. That's kind of the big elephant in the room as we're talking about economic development and those kind of inequalities, how the goals where the foundation saw it evolved with the changes.
Yes, thank you, Deborah. So with the Community Foundation, if you're not familiar with community foundations, they're place-based regional foundations that help individuals in various communities support the philanthropic interests that they have. And in Coffee County, there's a particular interest in continuing to drive economic development. It's been important in that community for decades, and especially for a community its size, I think it's something that makes Douglas unique. And so when we were brainstorming about how you can continue to grow economic development in a smaller, more rural community in Georgia, there was conversations about how has traditional economic development from more of a, attracting big business to improving quality of life, and how do those elements come together? So the idea was to engage some students. The people around the table said, well, if we want to, encourage people to come back to Douglas or to recruit new people to Douglas, let's get some perspective. And so we were thankful to get to work with the interns under Nancy's leadership from Georgia Tech, who really created a great team. I think that's one of this particular group is that the three of them together, it was a very multidisciplinary and disciplinary team. And they worked really well together in terms of using the data, but also going and doing those in-depth interviews to talk to people in town. Instead of in a small town just thinking, what's going on with all these various different businesses or people, because you've been there forever, going in with an objective standpoint and really talking to people, learning about the city and figuring how that matches up with the data that they found. And so I think that this was a great place to start for Douglas, and I hope that John and his team will help us with the foundation's help carry this forward and bring forth some of the ideas that they came up with in their plan with Nancy. As far as the pandemic goes, the pandemic has posed interesting challenges to just about every person on this globe in 2020, and this was no different. When we had originally had this conversation, it was pre-pandemic, and we had selected interns. They were going to come and live in Douglas, and so we transitioned to an all virtual model. But as part of that team, we were really fortunate to have Nija on the team, who is a Douglas resident, and we had chosen her because she had some unique insight into the community from living there, but also as part of that team, because she was working virtually but from home in Douglas, she was able to go out and document and photograph and kind of bring to light for some of the rest of the team what it looks like in Douglas and what the actualities are there. So I think that was a really important component. But I'm really pleased with the students' work. I hope that everybody in Coffee County and in Douglas is, and I look forward to looking at their recommendations and figuring out how we can use it as a litmus test for what projects and other economic development initiatives we take going forward.
Wonderful. Thank you, Julie. I like and agree with you on the multidisciplinary and just really understanding the locality and that importance around economic development. John, this is a nice segue to you. And you are actually from rural communities and now living and working here. Douglas has a population of, under 12,000, 11,300-ish. Coffee County is about 44,000. So, we are really talking about smaller, more rural communities. And, what do you think is the next stage of economic development growth for these types of communities, especially given the research that Nancy's done, and obviously with the support of local foundations like Julia's in terms of addressing, their growth and addressing some of these long-term inequalities that have been plaguing a lot of these communities?
I think within the past several years, we've really seen an emphasis placed on rural economic development, and there's really been a sea change in the thought, and it's no longer just industrial recruitment. You really do have to take a holistic approach. You've got to have the quality of life to make your community attractive for those kids that go off to school to come back to counter the brain drain. You've got to have the amenities that they're looking for new industries to come in and set up shop. It's really, you've got to focus constantly on the fundamentals. You've got to focus on that human capital that you have available, your workforce that you have out there. You've got to have it educated. And, there's a direct correlation between education levels and the well-being of communities. And we focus a lot on education. There were some comments in the profile that in the strategy section about working with your educational systems. That is fundamental. I think every practitioner should be doing that, especially in the rural areas, small towns. You've got to get with your K-12 system, your public school system. You've got to get with your technical schools. You've got to get with your universities if you have them in the area, and you've got to get your industries involved with those guys as well. Workforce is the number one site selection factor in the United States right now. The availability of skilled labor is tremendous. Everybody's got people. Not everybody has skilled labor. So you put one and one together, add education to that, and you've got a skilled workforce. Now, that's easier said than done. There are a lot of people that don't believe in investment in human capital. There are a lot of companies that are just looking for cheap labor. But again, in economic development, especially small towns, rural areas, we can't act from a point of desperation. We can't just throw incentives and start creating jobs for the sake of jobs. We've got to practice economic development. We've got to look at, are those wages above average? If not, you're skewing your average back down. We can't continue to incentivize things that are below average. And that's the approach that we're taking here now. No longer incentivizing below average. It's the easiest way to get the point across. Focus on the education levels at every aspect from pre-K through college. You've got to get your entire populace up to speed in the jobs. We can go 4 or 5 industries right here, right now that have signs out in front. They're desperate for workers. And I mean, this is one of the highest unemployment rates that we've had in the past decade. And they're starving for workers right now. But so too are a lot of other areas. And so labor's not as mobile as it used to be, and it has a lot more alternatives now. So convincing people that they need to come to your community, and Douglas is great. I had to go through the whole reconnaissance myself a couple of years ago before I came here. Douglas is a great community. We do have a lot of amenities for rural areas. Not everybody's that fortunate. So you've got to play up those assets that you have. And, tout them, sell that sizzle. Get the word out about all the assets that you do have consistently and constantly. Quit sitting back, waiting on somebody to bring you something, and get out there and sell yourself. And that's our approach now.
I appreciate your proactive approach. But how have your plans changed because of the pandemic? Now, how have you had to pivot given the state of things?
We have some serious concerns with some of our industries regarding that. But in general, because 20% of our workforce here is in manufacturing. Another large percentage of it's in healthcare and food service industries. So most of our workforce here was in the essential industries. So we never really shut down. We had to learn to adopt and adapt quickly. And because of that, those workers were taking those precautionary measures and personal protection equipment and things like that back home and practicing it. And so we really haven't shut down like a lot of the country has. We're a lot more careful about it. We do a lot of social distancing. I'm here in my office. A lot of my peers are still working from home, but we do that. We social distance at work. We practice good protection, and our industries have done the same. We've got one of our major employers, 1,000 jobs, is in a poultry production facility here. That was very concerning through the height of the pandemic over the summer. But they took the measures. They spent the money. They took the safety protocols and took it seriously and applied it. And it really helped their workforce there. It helped the community. And because of that, our workers have been able to stay engaged in employment. I think our unemployment rate right now is about 5%. It was at about 3.8%. So it hasn't really harmed us that much. We have had a couple of industries that are tied to the aviation industry that have slowed down a bit, waiting on air traffic to pick back up. But all in all, I think that we have been very blessed here. I can't speak for other small rural communities, but we have been very blessed here. And a lot of that, we have to thank the manufacturing and the diversity of the economy that we do have here.
Right. For our virtual audience, feel free to type in your questions to our panel. We can take it and read it on your behalf. So feel free to do it either in the chat box or in the Q&A. But let me continue with Nancy. And really, Douglas is pretty lucky to have, really great leadership like Julia and John really advocating on Douglas's behalf, and a number of other assets that John alluded to, from the manufacturing to poultry and whatnot. So in your research and in your experience, how do other similar smaller communities start if they don't have a Julia or a John really advocating and planning? How can a smaller, more rural community really start to go towards what you were describing as resilient and more sustainable economic development versus the very traditional economic development that you outlined?
Well, I think it's really important that in communities where a group of leaders come together and take an initiative, it's important, I think, not to ever rely on one source of the leadership, which is easy to do in a small community because there aren't lots of people stepping up. But to grow leadership, to recruit them and develop them so that they can come together and take on some of the tasks, I think is very important when you don't have the money to have a major agency or you aren't lucky enough to have a major foundation that's there. So that's one thing that I think is that community leadership and developing that and making it representative of the community is an important first step for small communities. Many small communities are really sort of satellites of bigger metro areas these days, but that's not really the case for Douglas. It is much more an independent economy. So, and Douglas is fortunate to have the capacity they've got right now, but they could also, develop other leaders within more to take on other roles, because as we all know, there's only so much you can do in your job. And John's job, for example, that's a very intensive job, maintaining contacts and seeking out new prospects, et cetera. So, in Douglas or other places, is there interest, focus on growing within as well, trying to develop entrepreneurs or support entrepreneurs from the community who, if they're successful, will expand in that community, creating more jobs and stay in the community, hopefully. So those are some strategies there that I think are important to attract the higher quality jobs and higher paying jobs, which John is emphasizing, but also to really focus on developing capacity within. And part of that is really, like he says, going from K through 12 and all the way into vocational or college, but to have some of those folks want to stay around, and maybe there's an entrepreneurship program that will help them. Maybe the local banks will get involved, or there'll be what we call angel investors, that there are wealthy individuals in the community that have been successful in business and are interested in investing in someone with a good idea. So those are some of the strategies. But also what they're trying to do as well is this whole idea of making it a place that the younger generation, the generation such as our interns, find as a community that they would like to have, come and work in or develop their own businesses in. That's one of the things, by the way, I think is great about the program is that the communities in the program are getting insights from students who, when they get out, are some of the most highly demanded workers that you can find. And not all of them want to be in big cities. A lot of them don't. So that's another aspect of it.
We are actually seeing more of that because of COVID, actually. So that might be an extra. And obviously, when it comes to talent, it's not only building that talent, like John was saying, with the education, but how to attract that talent into the community as well. We have a really good question from Larissa, and I think this is good for John and Julia. Is how do you convince maybe those people that might not be as excited about this economic development plan to come to your side and support? How do you convince? How do you persuade? What are those tactics or strategies to really get more, again, allies, advocates, champions on your side as you're going forward? Because as Nancy's saying, you can't just do it with one entity or one single person. How do you build that coalition that's required to really push, a more comprehensive economic development, whether it's at the Julia, your donors, or the board, or other supporters, or John with industry or other private sector community members.
Yeah, you could have the best laid plans, but without someone, a torchbearer with passion that's going to take those ideas and take them to the leadership. All leadership is not sitting around, thinking about these things daily. That's why your economic development program is so important to your community. You've got to have your chamber on board, your economic developers on board. You've got to take that to the elected officials. And just because you're an elected official doesn't necessarily make you a leader. So don't mistake that. Your leaders are the ones that are out there that are passionate. They're the ones that are speaking up at the community meetings, and they're the ones that attend those planning events and those type things. Those are the people that care about the community. And you've got to have someone with a passion and an education that understands some of these concepts. I mean, just putting them on paper doesn't mean someone's going to read it and understand it. They've got to be able to know what they're doing and how to practice economic development. And they've got to know what the goals are. If the community has very low goals or goals that are, the antithesis of these plans, it's going to be an uphill struggle. And I would say about 80% of the communities out there, the small rural communities, will find uphill struggles. But you've got to have somebody that's willing to bang their head against the wall until blood comes to their forehead. I've been there. I've done that. You've got to keep banging. You've got to keep working. And if you finally bleed enough, someone will listen to you. Someone will come to your aid, and you'll have at least someone that can help you get out there and carry that torch a little ways. But it's not always a guarantee. There are some lost causes out there.
Julia?
Yeah, I think I would add to what John says is that, it starts with education. People have to know what the needs and opportunities are and then how they can engage with them. And I think that's the beauty of the profile that the students did for Douglas is, anybody that I've talked to in Douglas about the plan who's read it or who was interviewed or who heard the students do their final presentation, they all nodded right along like, yep, that's exactly what's going on in our community, or that's definitely something that we could take advantage of to make Douglas a better place. And so what I really liked about the plan was that they didn't just do the profile of Douglas, but they looked for other communities who had addressed those same problems with similarly sized solutions. And so now when you go to the plan and you flip to the back and it has the students' recommendations, you can look at, how are we addressing racial inequities? Well, the foundation just made a grant for a Black business support fund that is making grants to small businesses that were more disproportionately negatively affected by the pandemic. Or, how do we look at the K through 12 or even the cradle to career pipeline? What are some initiatives that we can take there? But when you break it down into those pieces, I think individual people and leaders step forward for the piece that they might have a passion for and can really drive it together. Because like John said, it's not just a one-step approach. You really have to be taking a holistic approach. So finding ways to give options and show where the opportunities are to step up, I think is a first step.
Wonderful. All right, so final question for all three of our panelists, which is, where would you want to see Douglas 5 years from now? What would success look like in economic development? If there was like a front cover of Time magazine or Georgia Trend or something like that, profile on Douglas, what would you want that headline to be, or what would you want to be able to share if people ask, how's Douglas doing? Nancy, you're on mute.
I'll build off of what Julia just said. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. In 5 years, some of the things we identified, better job opportunities or wage earning opportunities for African Americans. Some of that will happen, I hope, with what John's doing. But in 5 years, will that make a huge difference? Will it be a big enough difference? Not yet, but if it's on an upward trend, that's going to be really significant. What I think could be really significant, building off what Julia said, is that you really did have this very strong group of motivated leaders that were each responsible for one part of the wide menu of things that really have to exist to create a quality, very desirable community. And that they engage the community itself. The community is well informed, and they're all working in support of it, and they're proud of what they're doing. I think it's terrific, by the way, that you just started this fund for supporting Black businesses. That's a great idea. But sort of building, if you had that cohort, that network put together within 5 years, and each was working on making progress, I think then the overall progress would really accelerate for Douglas, and it would be much more quickly become the kind of city it wants to be. So that's what I would say as my answer. I'll leave it to the other two.
And Deborah, mine's not necessarily a headline, but I guess my litmus test for success is when other small rural communities who have independent economies come to Douglas and say, how did you get started? And we can say, well, we had this great group of students from Georgia Tech. They did this, comprehensive profile. We had actionable items in it. We had community leaders that took an interest in it and stepped forward. And, maybe a metric of success is if, we're attracting Georgia Tech students to come and live and work in Douglas. So that's what I'm hopeful for.
Great answer. John?
Yeah, and I'll say, in 5 years is a very short period of time in geologic and economic development time. 5 years, it's hard to change minds and mindsets in 5 years. Those elephants out of the room and, those sacred cows and that sort of thing. But I would say, my goal, you've got to be realistic about your goals and where you want to be. And, I kind of use the metric of state average as what we're shooting for. And if we can get within, a 10, 20 percentile advancement closer to the state averages and wages and housing values and those types of things, that's really, something. It might not make the headlines, but it'll certainly put a smile on my face. And also, I'll focus on if we can get the school systems here, and we're working towards this right now, but career education and STEM education. Those are the two biggies right now. It kind of resolves all the issues in any, if you can focus on those two things.
Wonderful. Well, Nancy, Julia, John, thank you for a really interesting and fascinating conversation. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Again, this is the Smarter Together webinar. This is recorded, so feel free to come back and listen to this along with Nancy's slides. Stay tuned next Thursday morning for another exciting webinar on the future of work. Thank you again.
Thank you.